Over 30 years ago, the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union fell apart. People in Western countries were very confident and proud of this because it meant that democracies in North America, Western Europe, and other places would succeed and new democracies would emerge. The idea of communism had failed too, like absolute monarchies and medieval theocracies. So, in a nutshell, democracy was doing well, the world was peaceful, and other things didn't seem important. Then cut to 1994. Ukraine decided at the time to give up its nuclear weapons and rely on vague promises of security from the US, UK, and Russia. Given that the world was actually safe for democracies back then, it did seem like a good idea at the time. But looking back on it, it's been nothing other than a big mistake by the nation, because 20 years later, Russia's invasion of Ukraine took place in 2014. Yes, contrary to what you'd expect, the invasion actually started in 2014, and it wasn't until February 2022 that we witnessed the violent turn of Russia's scheme that's made the war on Ukraine one of the most discussed topics globally in the past decade. It's a topic that has led to questions about whether democracy can survive, and if this century will be filled with conflict, and questions about what it is Ukraine must do to finally become a democratic economy. To get the much needed answers to these questions, let's take a look at the facts. The first fact to note is that Russia's aggression against Ukraine has gone beyond conventional military tactics. They actually use grey zone operations to also undermine Ukraine. These operations include forced deportations, controlling the population by issuing Russian passports, attacking critical infrastructure, and spreading disinformation. These attacks are aimed at one thing: weakening Ukraine's resistance and eroding trust in its government and democratic institutions. However, for all these attacks are worth, they haven't been entirely successful for Russia. In fact, instead of becoming a failed state, Ukraine, through its resilience and adaptation, has proven to be far from that. The country has proven itself to be a nation led by effective governance, even during wartime. Now, you'd expect this fact to repel Russia from further pursuing its schemes to overtake Ukraine, but you'd be wrong. Instead of backing away due to Ukraine's resilience, the Russian regime has actually remained determined to conquer Ukraine still, by using various means at its disposal. Because of this, Ukraine and its partners face the daily challenge of not only strengthening resilience in non-military areas, but also focusing on physical survival and conventional warfare. In dealing with these issues, Ukraine has also revealed its functional democracy that sets it apart from authoritarian Russia. A functional democracy that is the reason why Ukraine has garnered support from people and governments around the world for her troubles since February 2022. The expectation now is that the war will serve as a catalyst for further modernizing and strengthening Ukraine's institutions, making them less vulnerable to Russia's political and economic influence. From this, we get our first point. One of the things Ukraine must do to finally become a democratic economy is reduce Russia's significant economic interests in its territory. For many years, Russia has actually relied on influential people to interfere in Ukraine's internal affairs. And as a matter of fact, these people Russia relies on are none other than Russian billionaires who've had significant economic interests in Ukraine, even after the first invasion in 2014. One example of these billionaires is Mikhail Friedman, a billionaire with close ties to President Vladimir Putin, who owns valuable assets in Ukraine, including a major telecom company and a large bank. Because the war has caused a lot of destruction, Ukraine's government needs to see how the wealth of these Kremlin-connected billionaires can pay for the rebuilding process. Also, even though the government has asked the EU, the United States, and others to freeze the assets of wealthy Russians, more speed needs to be placed in seizing the assets of Russian billionaires in Ukraine itself. Currently, the rate at which Russian billionaire assets have been seized in Ukraine has been pretty slow, and it's angered many people fighting against the corruption in their country. For instance, we know that the authorities did seize assets from one Russian billionaire, Vladimir Yevtushenkov, but it took a full 6 months after Russia's overall invasion. This is an example of why Ukraine needs to promptly establish ways to legally manage confiscated Russian assets to use them for the country's recovery. Additionally, Ukraine's government needs to adopt rules that would limit the influence of billionaires in politics, the public sphere, and the economy. The war in particular has already brought an end to the powerful groups of Ukrainian billionaires who have dominated the country's economy since 1991. Some of them have lost their assets in the parts of Ukraine that are now occupied, while others have fled abroad. The government and public institutions, on the other hand, have gained more legitimacy and trust from the people in the process of managing the war effectively, weakening the power of the billionaire groups. So, to nip it in the bud, having a policy that further limits the powers of the billionaire groups will birth a democratic economy for Ukraine. Thankfully, the European Commission has even made passing anti-billionaire laws one of the criteria for evaluating Ukraine's progress in becoming an EU member, so there's all the more reason to take that step. Now, we know that Ukraine faces the challenge of defending itself against Russia's aggression, whilst also making important reforms in public life and governance. And to tackle both tasks effectively, the government will need to strengthen the resilience of the entire society, meaning that Ukraine will need to be able to withstand the various types of attacks from Russia that aim to disrupt the country from within, while also implementing democratic reforms and building institutions to become a member of the EU. These sound like a lot at first, but they're steps that let us know that on Ukraine's journey to becoming less vulnerable to Russian influence, it's crucial that the country's ability to resist and push back goes hand in hand with democratic reforms. So, for instance, it will be important for Ukraine to have a fair and independent justice system that is not influenced by politics, as courts will play a key role in taking action against Russian agents of influence or sanctioned Russian assets. Also, support for independent and high-quality journalism will be essential to defend free speech and democratic values. Ukraine's civil society will also play a major role in this process of its democratic transformation, acting as a watchdog to ensure the government follows through on its commitments to reforms and preventing the return of the old oligarchic system. And finally, the actions and lessons learned from this war in Ukraine will have to be used to inform their efforts to strengthen their democracy against external aggression. For instance, we know that in the past, Russia used Ukraine as a testing ground for its hybrid warfare tactics before using them in the West. Now, however, Ukraine has the potential to be a model of democratic resilience that the European Union can promote to counter Russian and other autocratic interference in Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans. When this happens, it would represent a true shift in the EU's strategic approach, showing a full understanding by the organisation of its responsibility for security challenges in its neighbourhood, compared to its previous half-hearted attempts to contain the Russian threat. If anything, the war serves as a wake-up call to Europe and the Western world, as well as democracies worldwide, that the old belief in the power of might is right is no longer acceptable. We cannot allow big countries to do whatever they want to smaller countries, and people should have the ability to determine their own futures. This is why we must confront these forces whenever they come up. The Russian leaders invaded Ukraine for two main reasons: to prevent the formation of a strong Ukrainian state that could threaten the Russian Empire, and to quell Ukraine's democracy, which promotes the rule of law and fights against corruption. But the world is watching. The world, particularly people in Asia, Latin America, Africa, and even Europe, see Ukraine's courage and remain inspired by it. This is why what happens in Ukraine next, over time, will be very important, because it will send a strong message to anyone trying to become democratic, especially if they're close to powerful autocracies like China, Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. Alright then, that's all for today's video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, share this video and press that post notification bell so you don't miss out on our future videos. We analyse the latest trending economic news, so watch out, and until next time, take care.